Hey guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into the warm, smoky kitchens of ancient Mesopotamia, around 1750 BCE to be exact. You're standing just outside a temple complex in the bustling city of Nippur, where the air smells like sheep fat, burnt garlic, and something suspiciously fishy. The ziggurat looms above you like a stepped pyramid that never quite graduated to a point. The sun's going down, but inside the temple kitchens, the day is just heating up. Bronze pots clatter on open hearths, and somewhere in the corner, a donkey sneezes. You brush past a curtain made of dried reeds and duck inside. Immediately, it's hot. Too hot. Clay ovens glow a soft orange, and the entire space hums with low conversation, bubbling pots, and the scratch-scratch of styluses pressed into wet clay. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away, I'd love to know where you're watching and what time it is there. Let me know in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're just in time for dinner. Not yours, don't get too hopeful, but for the gods. Here in the temple, food isn't just food. It's sacred, it's accounting, it's politics, and in a roundabout way, it's also literature. Those clay tablets you'll see stacked neatly, on a shelf at the back. Some of the world's oldest recipe books. But don't expect colourful photos or even helpful measurements. These are more like notes from a very distracted chef who had to pause mid-sentence to put out a kitchen fire, and never came back. The head chef here is already shouting. You don't understand Akkadian, but tone is universal. Someone's burned the goat. Again. You take a seat on an overturned basket and pretend to be invisible. Nearby, a young scribe perches on a low bench with a lump of clay on his lap. He's scribbling something down while squinting into a pot. This is culinary history in the making. Or maybe he's just doodling a fish. What's amazing is that many of these tablets survive, not because ancient people had Tupperware, but because they accidentally baked their documents. A good city, fire would do the trick. It's ironic, really. Their buildings collapsed, their crops failed, but the dinner instructions, those endured. Right now, the kitchen's preparing a dish historians translate loosely as stew, though the original word is more of a poetic gesture than a recipe. It might include mutton, onions, garlic, leeks, and beer. Because yes, even the gods apparently preferred a meal slightly buzzed. You glance around at the tools. Sharp obsidian knives, grinding stones for spices, long-handled bronze ladles. There's a rhythm to the chaos. A short man with a scarred eyebrow throws salt into a pot with theatrical flair. Someone else fans the fire with a woven mat that's definitely seen better days. In the corner, a very old woman chants softly while kneading dough, her hands moving, with the steady confidence of someone who hasn't looked at a recipe in 60 years. It's not just about feeding deities. Temples like this are community centers, storehouses, banks, and yes, cookbook publishers. The temple staff might feed hundreds every day. Recipes had to be recorded. If only so, the next guy didn't mistake add coriander for summon the underworld. And here's the kicker. Many of these recipes don't even bother with quantities. A typical entry might read, take meat, boil, add garlic and fat. That's it. How much meat? What kind of fat? How long do you boil it? The scribe has moved on. You are now on your own. Historians still argue whether these were practical recipes or just ceremonial guides. Were they meant for real kitchens or just scribal training exercises? The truth is murky. But we do know one thing. They weren't written for you, or even for a cook. They were likely penned by pre-scribes who had never touched a ladle in their lives. There's something comforting about this chaos, though. The fire crackles. A thin stew bubbles slowly in a heavy pot. The air smells like roasted grain and sheep fat, with just a hint of something acrid, maybe burnt onions. Again, you watch a boy deliver a bowl of steaming food to a shrine, bowing low as he backs away. The gods, apparently, aren't big on table manners. They receive their offerings in silence, and once the smoke's cleared, the food is whisked away, and probably repurposed into someone else's lunch. The ancient Mesopotamians didn't see food the way we do. It wasn't personal, it was practical, spiritual, and deeply political. Feeding the gods meant keeping the universe in balance. Forget the salt and you might upset the fertility cycle. Burn the offering and you risk drought. No pressure. A cat slinks past your foot. You glance down. It blinks at you, unimpressed, then curls up beside a warm stone basin. Even in the middle of sacred ritual, life finds its own rhythm. And you're just an observer, lucky to witness the beginnings of humanity's relationship with written food. It started here, in kitchens, like this, not with cookbooks bound in leather, not with signature dishes or secret sauces, but with clay, fire, a lot of guesswork, and scribes who did their best with no measurements and a dangerously vague definition of done. And somehow, despite all that, people still got fed. You're still seated on that overturned reed basket, only now your legs are beginning to go numb. A sleepy warmth pulses from the clay hearth beside you, and the kitchen is still clattering along, less like a symphony and more like a goat running, loose through a pot shop. But now your eyes are drawn to something oddly mesmerizing in the corner. A stack of small damp clay tablets arranged with the same reverence as freshly baked bread. Each one is roughly the size of a modern smartphone, though much heavier and infinitely more edible looking. The surface is etched with a tight matrix of cuneiform signs, those wedge-shaped marks that make Akkadian look like someone tried to program a microwave using a stick. A young scribe, no older than 16, is hunched over one of the slabs, stylus in hand, brow furrowed as if trying to remember whether goat fat goes before or after the crushed coriander. These scribes were the human copy-paste buttons of their time, and make no mistake, they were critical. Without them, nothing got remembered, nothing got counted, and no one got properly credited for inventing, say, soup, which is where you are now, watching this poor apprentice try to transcribe a bubbling stew in real time, glancing nervously between the pot and his increasingly smudged clay. It's a ridiculous task when you think about it. He's trying to describe something dynamic, ingredients shifting with each ladle, spices tossed in impulsively, onto a medium that can't be edited without a chisel and regret. You can almost hear the panic in his stylus as he jabs the sign, for onion, one last time. Too bad he already wrote garlic twice. And yet, despite the chaos, this is how the earliest known recipe collection came to be. 3 clay tablets recovered from the ruins of a long-forgotten city, most likely, from a temple kitchen just like this one. Known as the Yale Culinary Tablets, they contain roughly 35 recipes, each one about as vague as a fortune cookie riddle. Let's take one for example. Its Akkadian title, if it even had one, doesn't translate easily, but it might be something like meat in broth with aromatics. The full instruction reads, take meat, prepare water, add fat, cook with crushed leek and garlic, add vinegar, stir. And that's it. No mention of how much meat, what kind of vinegar, or even what you're supposed to do once it's cooked. Serve it? To whom? With what? The silence is deafening. Still, historians have managed to reconstruct some of these dishes through sheer academic stubbornness, and maybe a little culinary masochism. Some recreations suggest these stews were rich, deeply seasoned, and actually quite sophisticated for the time. Others taste like regret and overboiled mutton. It depends on who's cooking, and more importantly, how they interpret crushed aromatics. The scribe in front of you pauses to scratch his head with the corner of his stylus. A bit of clay sticks to his temple. He glances over to the kitchen master, who's now arguing with a priest about the sacred ratio of coriander to cumin. You begin to see the pattern. Recipes weren't just culinary guides. They were power statements. Codifying temple meals was a way to assert control, maintain consistency, and document the divine order of things, even if no one ever followed them exactly. It's kind of like writing down your grandma's cookie recipe, only to realize later. It just says, add enough flour until it feels right, and bake until golden. Thanks, Grandma. And yet, that's part of the charm. These weren't instructions. They were memory prompts for someone already deeply steeped in the tradition of the dish. Which makes sense when you realize that cooking, in this era, wasn't a personal art. It was a ritual, a duty, a communal contract. Historians still argue whether these recipes were actually used in kitchens or were just theoretical exercises meant for training scribes. Some believe they were never meant to be followed step by step, but rather served as a kind of poetic shorthand for experienced cooks. Others think they might have been ceremonial, read aloud before the meal as an offering to the gods, or just copied endlessly for scribal practice. Regardless, the act of writing them down was revolutionary. It marks the beginning of a tradition that would stretch across millennia, through medieval European cookbooks, Ottoman culinary scrolls, and eventually, your aunt's laminated Pinterest printouts. All of it traces back to these hot, smoky kitchens, where a teenager with clay under his fingernails struggled to capture the essence of meat in broth. Another scribe enters the room, older and grumpier. He glances at the boy's tablet, snorts, and starts rewriting it without a word. You watch as he presses symbols into the damp clay with the weary precision of someone who's done this too many times. This isn't art for him, it's accounting. Accuracy matters, but so does finishing before the stew burns. Meanwhile, a pot clinks, and you glance up to see someone carrying a steaming bowl toward the shrine alcove. It's the third such offering this hour. You wonder if the gods ever get full, or if, like most middle managers, they just pretend to appreciate every potluck dish. The bowl is placed on a low altar. The scribe recites something under his breath. Then the bowl is quietly whisked away, and the cycle begins again. You lean back against the wall, the warmth from the hearth soaking into your spine. Your eyes wander to the reed mat ceiling, where soot stains tell the story of countless fires and near disasters. Somewhere outside, a dog barks. A child laughs. Life continues, but here in the temple kitchen, time feels thick, like stew. It simmers, reduces, becomes something you can almost taste. And as you sit there, you realize the clay tablet in that scribe's hand isn't just a record of dinner. It's a snapshot of a civilization's priorities, its rituals, its tastes, its humanity trying to tame the fleeting, ephemeral nature of food, transforming it into something permanent, something that might outlast fire, flood, or even famine. You shift your weight on the reed basket, your legs grateful. The scribe finishes his tablet with a final press of his stylus, smoothing the edges before placing it gently on the shelf. It looks exactly like the others, except now, it's infused with the heat of a kitchen, the sweat of a temple, and the desperate scribbles of a boy who just wanted to get it right. You're barely adjusting to the thick smells of the temple kitchen. The boiled meat, the puff of ash from the clay oven, the oddly sweet scent of date syrup being reduced in a shallow bronze pan. When the head cook stomps past you, muttering something under his breath, you catch only a few words: goat, garlic, and what you assume is an ancient Akkadian swear word. He's not angry at you, thankfully. He's furious at the goat stew. Again. The goat stew is a kind of celebrity in this kitchen. It's made daily, served at temples, taverns, royal banquets, and poor men's fire pits alike. It's the Mesopotamian version of that one dish everyone knows how to mess up slightly differently. And today, the problem is texture. The meat is too tough, the fat hasn't rendered properly, and some apprentice apparently added the garlic before the water was hot. Blasphemy, culinary and otherwise. Still, even in its flawed form, this goat stew is one of the oldest recorded dishes on Earth. Now imagine that, somewhere around 3,700 years ago, Someone looked at a hunk of animal muscle, a few handfuls of garlic, and a clay bowl, and thought, yes, let's make something immortal. You scoot a little closer to the pot, trying to ignore the scalding heat radiating off its bronze sides. The stew is bubbling unevenly, the occasional chunk of goat floating like a prehistoric dumpling. Someone stirs it with a ladle carved from palm wood, muttering under his breath. You ask, very politely, what he's making, and he replies with a phrase that sounds something like "Sie zum Shootum." You nod slowly, pretending to understand, even though you absolutely do not. This stew, you learn, is part of a dish referred to on one of the Yale culinary tablets. Though it sounds mysterious, it essentially boils down to meat cooked in aromatic broth. But don't let the simplicity fool you. This dish was revered. It was both daily sustenance and divine offering, both home comfort and temple formality, and it almost always featured 3 main stars: goat, garlic, and fat. Why goat? Well, sheep and goats were common in Mesopotamia. Pigs existed, but they were frowned upon by the upper classes and often associated with filth. Cattle were expensive and used mostly for ploughing or ceremonies. But goats were everywhere, and if you've ever had to sleep near one, you know, they're not exactly quiet. Still, they provided meat, milk, hides, and a decent excuse to hold a community feast. Garlic, meanwhile, was a superstar in the ancient world. It was pungent, cheap, and, depending on whom you asked, good for everything, from stomach aches to evil spirits. Ancient Mesopotamians didn't just use it in cooking. They smeared it on wounds, tucked it in bedding, and probably chewed it raw to prove points in arguments. A real overachiever of an ingredient. And then there's the fat, usually sheeptail fat or clarified butter. It was your only shot at richness in a world where flavor meant not entirely burnt. But it also served another purpose: symbolism. Fat was associated with luxury, fertility, and offerings. You didn't just eat it, you made sacrifices with it. You rubbed it on temple statues. You anointed sacred objects with it. If modern foodies have truffle oil, ancient Mesopotamians had goat fat. Same vibe, different texture. Now here's where it gets weird. The recipe on the tablet doesn't mention salt, not once, which is baffling. Salt was everywhere in Mesopotamia. It was mined, traded, fought over. Whole towns were built around salt production. And yet this recipe, like many others, just forgets it. Historians still argue whether salt was such a staple that it went without saying, or if it was added at the table like a garnish. Some believe salt was so tied to religious ritual that it wasn't even mentioned in mundane records. Others think the scribes just forgot. You lean toward the latter theory after watching The Apprentice add leeks, garlic, and goat fat, in that order, directly into a cold pot. Still, there's beauty in the chaos. The pot begins to bubble gently. A film of golden fat rises to the top. A young boy adds a splash of beer. Yes, beer into the mix. Apparently it helps break down the meat, adds flavor, and if nothing else, makes the stew smell like someone's drunk uncle's breath. This wasn't just cooking, it was chemistry, ritual, a dance between instinct and tradition. Recipes weren't sacred texts, but they held power. They connected one cook to another across generations. They told you not just what to eat, but how to be a person. How to feed your gods, how to serve your family, how to survive. You're offered a taste. It's served in a rough ceramic bowl, still hot enough to fog your eyebrows. The meat is chewy, sure, but the broth is alive. It's rich, oniony, laced with hints of garlic and something slightly bitter, like scorched beer. It's not gourmet, but it's nourishing, it's honest, and it's old, so old. As you sip slowly, you overhear a debate at the corner table. 3 scribes are arguing about whether vinegar goes before or after the garlic. One says it should be reduced first. Another insists it should be added at the very end. The third just shrugs and says, "It depends if you're cooking for humans or gods." That's the problem, and the magic with these ancient recipes. They're incomplete fragmentary, wrapped in riddles. You have to read between the lines. Boil meat, add fat, add garlic. Sure, but how long? How hot? Do you simmer, sear, slow cook, or just pray? The answers are gone, lost in the steam that rose from these pots 3,000 years ago. And yet here you are, tasting history one spoonful at a time. It doesn't matter that the scribe spelled onion wrong 3 times, or that the goat is slightly underdone. What matters is that someone wrote this down, that they cared enough to preserve a fleeting moment, the warmth of a meal, the memory of garlic, and entrust it to clay. You finish your bowl slowly. The kitchen quiets for a moment as if satisfied. The gods have eaten, the scribes have written, the stew has survived another day, and so have you. You've survived the goat stew. Not bad, honestly. And now you're back on your feet, slowly pacing the uneven stone floor of the temple kitchen. Your hands still smell faintly of smoke and garlic, and there's something oddly comforting about it. Outside, the day is slipping into twilight. Shadows stretch across the mud brick courtyard, and a dry breeze carries the earthy scent of crushed barley. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brays, as if annoyed that it wasn't invited to dinner. But tonight's main meal isn't for mortals, not entirely anyway. You find yourself drawn toward the inner sanctum of the kitchen complex, a smaller chamber lit by oil lamps and heavy with reverence. This is where the food meant for the gods is prepared. Not eaten, mind you, prepared, fed to the divine statues, arranged on polished altars, then quietly removed once the gods have consumed the essence. You slip inside, careful not to interrupt. The floor here is swept clean. The air smells sharply of frankincense and boiled onions. An odd combination, but it somehow fits. 2 temple cooks are working in practiced silence. One of them, older and broad-shouldered, is crushing coriander, seeds with a flat stone. The other slices leeks with a knife so worn, it's more suggestion than blade. Tonight, they're making a dish that must be perfect. No burnt edges, no undercooked fat. This offering will be presented to Enlil, the great sky god, and the last time someone forgot to strain the broth properly, half the temple staff came down with something unpleasant and suspiciously gastrointestinal. Divine judgment? Maybe. Poor hygiene? Also maybe. As you watch, you realize this dish isn't all that different from the stew you tasted earlier. It uses many of the same ingredients, meat, onions, garlic, beer, but with one crucial difference: intention. This isn't food for nourishment. It's a message, a prayer in edible form. The Mesopotamians believed that gods had senses. They could smell, taste, enjoy. And while the gods didn't physically eat the food, they absorbed its essence during ritual. The leftovers were often consumed later by temple staff, who didn't seem to mind the second-hand sanctity or the free meal. You glance at the offering table. It's a low, polished slab of dark stone, smoothed by centuries of meals and incense ash. A wide, shallow bowl waits at the center, flanked by smaller dishes for bread, beer, and dried fruit. You notice something peculiar. A garland of herbs, fresh coriander, thyme, maybe mint, looped in a figure 8 and draped over the edge of the bowl. It's decorative, but also symbolic. Herbs weren't just flavor enhancers. They were sacred, protective. Each one had a meaning, and using the wrong combination could send the wrong message. You wonder how many feasts were ruined not by bad cooking, but by poor symbolism. Imagine offering a fertility herb to a god of war. Awkward. One of the cooks nods to the apprentice, who brings over a clay tablet, freshly inscribed. You peer over, his shoulder, and squint at the cuneiform. It's a familiar format. Short, choppy phrases, no measurements, no instructions. Just a list of actions. Take meat, crush garlic, add beer, boil, stir, serve. Historians still argue whether these recipe tablets were meant as checklists or ceremonial records. Some scholars believe they served more as documentation of offerings than practical kitchen guides. Others insist they were the earliest attempts at culinary standardization, helping temple chefs maintain consistency. After all, feeding gods wasn't a hobby, it was logistics. The line between religion and bureaucracy was thin in ancient Mesopotamia. Temples were the economic hubs of the city. They controlled grain storage, livestock, textiles, and yes, food production. Feeding the sea gods was as much about maintaining divine favor as it was about showing off temple wealth and efficiency. If the sky god's meal was well prepared, surely the barley harvest would be generous. You step aside as the head cook arrives, inspecting the stew with a solemn frown. He dips a finger, tastes, nods once. The apprentice lets out an audible sigh of relief. The stew is ladled into the offering bowl with great care. Not a drop spilled, not a chunk of meat out of place. It's more art than cuisine. Culinary origami, folded with reverence and practiced hands. Then comes the ritual. A priest enters, his robe stiff with starch and symbolism. He carries a bundle of incense and begins a soft chant, words rising and falling like the rhythm of a distant tide. You don't understand the language, but you recognize the tone. Reverent, imploring, gently coaxing the gods to lean down and sniff the stew. You half expect a statue to blink. The priest circles the offering table 3 times, waving the incense bundle. The air thickens. Your head swims. Maybe it's the smoke, or maybe it's the sheer weight of tradition pressing down on this quiet room. Thousands of years of repetition, of offerings given and accepted, of meals served to unseen guests. And just like that, it's done. The priest bows. The cook removes the bowl. The food has been consumed, the divine essence extracted. The kitchen can now exhale. Someone starts laughing softly in the corner, relieved. You can almost hear the gods smacking their divine lips. Of course, this entire ritual raises a few questions. If the gods never really ate the food, was it wasteful to prepare it so carefully? Historians debate this endlessly. Some argue it was purely symbolic, meant to demonstrate human devotion and skill. Others suggest the ritual nourished the divine spirit in some metaphysical way. Still others believe the whole thing was a clever way to provide meals for priests and scribes without calling it dinner. You're inclined to agree with the last group, especially after seeing how quickly the used food is carried back out and shared among the temple staff. Sacred, sure, but also tasty. You step back into the outer kitchen and find it already bustling again. Another batch of meat is being trimmed, this time lamb. A bowl of lentils soaks nearby, along with flatbread dough rising slowly under a woven cloth. The cook who prepared the offering returns to his station, wiping his hands on a flax apron. He looks neither exalted nor enlightened, just hungry. You realize something else, something small but oddly profound. The food offered to the gods wasn't special in its ingredients. It didn't use rare spices or secret techniques. What made it divine was how it was treated, carefully, respectfully, with the belief that cooking wasn't just survival, but communication. And maybe deep down that's the whole point. You lean against the warm clay oven, letting your eyelids drift half closed. The rhythmic scrape of ladles, the low murmur of scribes, the occasional hiss of fat hitting hot bronze. It all blends into a kind of lullaby. Even the fire's crackling sounds sleepy now. You've watched food prepared not for hunger, but for hope. You've seen garlic sliced with reverence, beer poured with intention, meat stirred as if each turn might change the weather. It's a world where recipes have no measurements, yet every dish is weighed in spirit. And just when you think you've seen it all, a novice walks by carrying something unexpected. A tall, narrow jar sealed with wax and wrapped in reeds. You follow him with your eyes as he disappears into the cellar, where fermentation, the true alchemy of Mesopotamian cooking, quietly waits. But that's a story for later. For now, let the scent of coriander and lamb stew settle in your thoughts. Let the flickering oil lamps cast soft shadows on the clay. Let the knowledge that someone, 4,000 years ago, wrote down "add garlic" with as much pride as a poet setting down verse rock you gently into rest. The stew has simmered, the gods have dined, and the kitchen settles into a rare moment of quiet, a gentle lull before the next storm of chopping, boiling, and shouting. You take this opportunity to explore the shelves in the rear storage alcove, your sandals crunching softly over scattered bits of broken clay and dried herbs. Stacked neatly, well, as neatly as anything gets in a 1750 BCE kitchen, are bundles of clay tablets wrapped in palm leaf fibres. Some are fresh and damp, others dry and pale with age, their inscriptions hardened by time or accidentally fired by a long-forgotten kitchen blaze. Each one is unique, some flat and wide, others long and curved like bricks. You run your finger over one at random, feeling the faint grooves of ancient text, a culinary breadcrumb trail left by someone who wanted their stew remembered. Your fingers land on one that catches your eye. It's darker than the others and heavier. You lift it slowly. The surface is slightly glazed, either from fire or use, and across its front is a short, simple inscription, Shulhatu. Your mind scrambles to recall the meaning. Ah yes, boiled meat. And thus begins your dive into the surprisingly deep question, what even is soup? You wander back to the main kitchen, still holding the tablet like it's a treasure map. You find a relatively clean corner and crouch, studying the text. The recipe is brief, like most. It instructs, take water, add meat, fat, salt, leek, garlic, boil well, remove scum, add more water if thick, serve hot, that's it. No type of meat mentioned, no idea how long to cook it, and no mention of quantities. You could be making a small bowl for a sickly priest or feeding a battalion. Who knows? And yet there's something charming about it. It's soup in its purest form. Ingredients, heat, and patience. Suddenly, someone plops down beside you. It's a young cook, barely out of boyhood, covered in soot and carrying a dented ladle like a weapon. He sees your tablet and chuckles. Everyone wants to write about Shulhatu, he says. But no one writes it the same. He's right. There are at least 6 known variants of this same recipe across different tablets, some with vinegar, others without. Some call for spices that don't even grow in the region. One tablet, possibly written by a scribe with no culinary experience at all, lists fish fat and blood as optional flavorings. You try not to gag. Historians still argue whether all these versions refer to the same dish or if shulhatu was a blanket term for meat stuff in hot liquid. It's likely that the exact composition depended on region, class, season, and the mood of whoever happened to be cooking. This brings up a broader truth about Mesopotamian cuisine. It wasn't standardized. There were no MasterChef competitions, no culinary schools, no food critics, unless you count the gods. Cooking was passed down through experience, through watching and tasting and smelling, not through precise instruction. You set the tablet down beside you and stare into the hearth. Someone's preparing a fresh batch of, well, something. It's hard to tell. A pile of crushed legumes, leeks, and what might be chopped dates are being stirred into a boiling cauldron. The smell is rich, nutty, with a faint sweetness, maybe a kind of pottage. Pottage is a catch-all term modern historians use to describe the endless variations of mush in a bowl that sustained the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, it could include lentils, barley, emmer wheat, crushed chickpeas, even wild greens. If it was spring. If you were lucky, a bit of dried meat or cheese got tossed in. If you were unlucky, it was mostly water and hope. And yet, people ate it, daily, happily, because it filled the belly, warmed the hands, and gave them just enough energy to keep hauling clay or ploughing fields or copying cuneiform under flickering lamps. You stand up and drift toward the cook, curious. She gives you a tired smile and offers a taste. The spoon is hot and slightly gritty. The pottage is surprisingly good. Earthy, creamy from the lentils, sharp from the leeks, and just a hint of something floral. Coriander, maybe fenugreek, hard to say. Ancient spices don't always translate cleanly into modern terms. Still, the effect is calming, comforting even. You take another bite and another until you realize you're now holding the entire bowl. The cook laughs and lets you finish. It's fine. There's more where that came from. You thank her and step outside into the courtyard, bowl in hand. The city of Nippur sprawls before you in shades of tan and dusty red. The sun is sinking behind the ziggurat, casting long shadows. Over the canal, you sit on a low wall and watch as vendors pack up their stalls. Children chase each other through puddles, and the sky turns that deep, sleepy violet that always signals the end of a long, hot day. You reflect on how far this humble soup has come, from clay tablets to your bowl. It's a dish born out of necessity, shaped by scarcity, made special by ritual. And yet it still feels timeless. You could easily be in a tiny kitchen in 2025, staring into a pot and wondering, did I put in too much garlic? Some things never change. Your thoughts wander to a scholarly debate you read once. Some archaeologists believe that shulhitu wasn't even a real recipe, but a metaphor, a stand-in for any liquid-based meal served communally. Others insist it was a signature dish, replicated precisely in temple kitchens and elite households. A few even argue it was medicinal, used to restore balance in the body or purify the soul. You find all three explanations plausible, and you find it soothing that no one can quite agree. There's comfort in mystery. As you sip the last of your stew, a stray cat hops onto the wall beside you. It sniffs the empty bowl, then curls up beside your elbow, clearly unimpressed by your portion control. You scratch behind its ears and watch as the last light fades from the city. Somewhere in a neighboring kitchen, a new batch of soup is already bubbling. Another cook is squinting into a pot. Another apprentice is scribbling on clay. The cycle continues. Flavor, memory, fire, and words. You lean back, full and content, and think, soup isn't just food, it's a language, and you're finally learning to speak it. You wake the next morning, not from a bed, but from the surprisingly forgiving warmth of woven reed mats laid out behind the temple kitchen. The faint smell of last night's stew still lingers in your clothes. Overhead, the first amber rays of sun peek across the flat rooftops of Nippur, brushing the mud-brick skyline with gold. It's early, too early for most people, but not for temple kitchens. Already, the fire pits are glowing faintly, coaxed to life by apprentices still blinking away sleep. A pot clangs. A goat somewhere in the alley complains about something, probably life in general. And just beyond the corner wall, a soft bubbling noise catches your ear. It's not stew, it's not pottage. It's something lighter, more liquid, almost frothy. You follow the sound until you find the source. A wide, shallow basin full of golden brown liquid being stirred slowly with a long stick. Beer soup, says a cook behind you, with the same tone someone might use to say, Monday again, beer soup, or rather, something like it. You watch as grain mash, already fermented overnight, is slowly brought to a simmer with water, onions, herbs, and, of course, garlic. The resulting mixture smells complicated, like a porridge, a broth, and a very bad decision all collided in a ceramic jug. And yet, this was breakfast for many in Mesopotamia, especially the working class. Forget your omelets and toast. Ancient Mesopotamians often started the day with a light meal known as kash, which included thick beer, closer to a nutritious gruel than something you'd order at a bar, flatbread, and sometimes lentils or dates. The beer wasn't for a buzz, though that was a common side effect. It was clean, calorie-rich, and surprisingly nourishing. The mixture in the pot today is a variation of this ancient breakfast tradition, and while it's warming gently on the hearth, the cook beside you explains that they're adding leek and mint today. Something softer on the gods' stomachs, she jokes. You peer closer and notice the bubbles. Not a rolling boil, but a soft fermentation foam that tickles the surface like the world's least aggressive volcano. There's something oddly comforting about the way it simmers, like a pot that knows it has all morning and nowhere to be. One of the scribes strolls in, stretching, yawning, rubbing the clay from his eyes. Without even looking, he grabs a wooden cup and dips it into the brew. He takes a sip, smacks his lips, nods approvingly, then walks away, clearly impressed that someone remembered the mint. You try it too. The first taste is peculiar. Sour but earthy. A little smoky from the firewood. You get a hint of date sweetness, then the slight tingle of fermented grain. Not unpleasant, just unexpected. It tastes like history, like someone poured barley, time, and uncertainty into a pot and called it a morning. And here's the wild part. This wasn't just food, it was math. Brewing beer in Mesopotamia was a highly controlled process, often documented on clay tablets that looked more like accounting records than kitchen notes. Grain rations, fermentation times, ratios of water to malt, all calculated, all recorded, all managed by temple administrators. Because beer wasn't just sustenance, it was currency, it was tribute, it was part of contracts, payments, even religious offerings. In fact, some temples employed full-time brewers alongside priests, scribes, and cooks. These weren't just artisans, they were alchemists, managing a process that turned humble grain into divine liquid. The yeast may have been invisible, but its effects were understood, if not scientifically, then spiritually. Historians still debate how alcoholic this beer actually was. Most agree it was probably low in alcohol by today's standards, more like a weak ale or fermented porridge. But others argue that certain varieties served during festivals or sacred rites might have packed a more serious punch. There are even records of ceremonial intoxication, celebrations where getting tipsy wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. For the gods, of course. But here's the kicker. This beer soup, it didn't always come with a recipe, much like the stews and porridges of temple kitchens. Beer-based dishes were often undocumented in specific terms. Sure, we have tablet fragments that describe grain preparation, soaking times, and even fermentation rituals, but actual recipes for beer. Soup as a dish? Nearly non-existent, which means this morning's brew, the one you're sipping right now, might be one of the most historically accurate recreations. Created by sheer accident, the cook hands you a piece of flatbread, thin, slightly smoky, still warm. You tear a piece and dunk it into your beer soup, and suddenly it makes sense. The softness of the bread absorbs the sharpness of the brew, the sour notes mellow, the warmth deepens. Now you understand why this was breakfast. It doesn't just fill you, it anchors you. And while you're sitting there, happily chewing history, an older scribe plops down beside you and begins to talk. He's a talker. You learn that his name is something unpronounceable, so you mentally dub him Old. Ram. Ram tells you in great detail about the time he miswrote a beer fermentation record and got blamed for an entire batch turning sour. Apparently the gods were not amused, and neither was the temple quartermaster. Ram had to scrub fermentation jars with river reeds for a month. You nod sympathetically, slurping your soup. Then he says something interesting. Back then, they thought spoiled beer meant the gods were angry. Now we just blame apprentices. It makes you think. Every meal in Mesopotamia, no matter how humble, had two audiences, the body and the divine. If your stew was watery, your bread underbaked, your beer too sour, it wasn't just bad luck. It might be bad favor. Maybe the stars had shifted. Maybe your prayers weren't loud enough. Or maybe, just maybe, someone used old leeks. And yet, meals like this continued, daily, without fuss or fanfare. Despite all the divine pressure, people still got up, brewed their mash, kneaded their dough, and fed their families. Old Ram finishes his soup, wipes his mouth with a sleeve that was already dirty, and stands. The gods don't taste much, he mutters. But they notice when you skip breakfast. You laugh quietly. He's probably right. You sit a little longer, watching the pot bubble. Someone adds a handful of herbs, Another cook yawns and tosses in a dried fig. The flavor shifts slightly, subtly, and yet the dish continues unchanged. It's like a story rewritten 1,000 times, always different, always the same. You dip your bread again and think about the strangeness of it all, that a civilization as vast and mighty as Mesopotamia began its day with beer soup, and someone cared enough to record that, even if they didn't include the measurements. You stretch. The morning sun is stronger now, spilling golden light across the temple's inner courtyard. Voices grow louder. Someone is already preparing lunch. The cycle continues. But for now, you're full. You're grounded. You're part of something older than kings, older than cities. You've sipped the broth that launched 1,000 clay tablets, chewed the bread that lined the stomachs of scholars, scribes, and shepherds alike. And you're ready, finally, to explore what came next in the long, strange journey of Mesopotamian cuisine. But not before you finish your soup. You've had your beer soup, your belly's warm, and the temple kitchen is now in full swing again. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleats nervously, possibly sensing that its fate lies not in grazing fields, but in a cauldron seasoned with garlic and coriander. The fire pits roar. Apprentices shuffle from storeroom to hearth like bees in a dusty hive, and you find yourself drawn toward a quieter corner of the kitchen, not the loud chaos of boiling pots or the scolding of undercooked barley. No. This is the back area, the linguistic heart of the culinary operation. A long wooden table stretches out beneath a narrow window, bathed in soft morning light. Here, several scribes are hunched over lumps of fresh clay, styluses tapping in rhythm like the ticking of an invisible clock. But they're not writing royal edicts or tallying grain deliveries. They're writing food, or trying to anyway. You watch one scribe sigh heavily, glance down at his half-formed tablet, and then whisper to his colleague, "How do you spell Zumaru again?" The other scribe doesn't even look up. With the high wedge, not the curl. You use the curl. That's onion, not cress. Welcome to the frustrating, oddly charming world of Akkadian foodie lingo. If you've ever been confused reading a modern recipe that says season to taste, just imagine doing it in a language where fat, cream, and butter all look the same on a bad day, and where boil, simmer, and render might all be written with the same 3 signs depending on how rushed the scribe was. Cuneiform. The script used to write Akkadian, among other languages, wasn't exactly designed for food writing. It's not what you'd call culinary friendly. Developed first by the Sumerians and later adapted by the Akkadians, it was mostly used for trade, law, astronomy, and epic poetry. Cooking instructions. That came later, and even then, only in a handful of cases. You peer over a tablet being written now, noticing the same symbols repeated again and again. Something like take, crush, boil, add. These were the anchor verbs of Mesopotamian cuisine, and while they seem simple, their meanings often varied depending on the cook, the city, or the god being served. For instance, the Akkadian word nataku can mean to boil, to cook, or to render. The word kalu could mean to hold, to serve, or to pour. Even the word shikaru, which many scholars translate as beer, might also refer to a sweet fermented barley drink closer to mead or thick kvass. It depended on the context, and the scribe, and the day. Historians still debate whether ancient cooks understood these nuances intuitively, or if the confusion we see now was equally frustrating back then. One camp argues that temple chefs and scribes worked closely, verbally clarifying, as needed. Another believes scribes wrote these tablets mostly for bureaucratic reasons, documenting rations or temple offerings rather than practical instructions. Still, you can't help but smile at the idea of a cook glaring at a scribe and saying, "You wrote lamb, not mutton." Again, you ease down beside the youngest scribe at the table. His name is Enli, and he's in the process of writing out a recipe for fish stew, though half the fish are still swimming in a clay jar by the hearth. You ask what he's working on, and he shrugs, muttering, They told me to record what we made yesterday, but I don't remember what we used, so I'm making it up. You blink. He shrugs again. It always starts with meat, onions, and garlic, right? If I add coriander and beer, no one will question it. He isn't wrong. The flavor profile of Mesopotamian food was actually surprisingly consistent. Common ingredients included leeks, onions, garlic, coriander, cumin, mint, dates, barley, lentils, and various fats from sheep or sesame oil. Spices were aromatic rather than hot. Sugar as we know it didn't exist, but dates and grape must added sweetness. Salt was plentiful, either mined or gathered from evaporation ponds and used liberally. And yet no tablet ever says, salt to taste. Instead, the act of salting might be implied by the word to season, or sometimes just left out entirely. Some scholars theorize that salt was so obvious it didn't need to be mentioned, like how your grandma never wrote breathe on a recipe card, but still expected you to do it. You look over Enley's shoulder as he scrawls a final line. Add liquid and cook until thick. You raise an eyebrow. What kind of liquid? You ask. Water? He shrugs. Maybe, or beer, or broth. Depends what's left. It's at this moment you realize something beautiful. These tablets, confusing as they are, reflect not rigid rules but culinary flexibility. They assume the reader had experience, intuition, a sense of taste and smell. They weren't for first-time cooks. They were reminders, anchors of tradition and muscle memory. Modern chefs might call this cooking by feel. Ancient Mesopotamians simply called it cooking. You ask Enley if scribes ever got in trouble for writing a recipe wrong. Oh, all the time, he laughs. One time I forgot to write garlic on a fish stew recipe, and the high priest thought the gods were offended. I had to write it 30 times the next day, just the word shumu. Garlic, 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 my wrist still hurts. You nod solemnly. A world without garlic is no world at all. But this brings you to another revelation. Garlic appears in nearly every recipe. So does leek. So does coriander. These weren't just ingredients, they were expectations. The culinary holy trinity, if you will. A dish without these basics was seen as incomplete, insufficient, possibly even disrespectful. You wonder if scribes like Enley ever got bored of writing the same ingredients day after day. Based on his current doodle of what looks like a dancing goat in the corner of his tablet, the answer is yes. Still, these recipe tablets weren't just about food. They were acts of preservation. In a world where oral tradition was everything, where memory reigned, and measurement was imprecise, writing it down was a big deal, even if what was written was vague, redundant, or weirdly poetic. Take, for example, a line from one of the Yale culinary tablets that reads, "Boil the meat until it is silent." Silent? What does that even mean? Historians have debated for years. Some say it refers to the sound of bubbling stopping. Others think it means soft or tender. A few believe it's metaphorical, cooking the aggression out of the animal, returning it to stillness. You kind of like that idea. Enley stands, stretches, and heads off to deliver his tablet to the kiln. You stay behind, staring at the half-formed sentences, the smudged signs, the curled edge where someone probably sneezed mid-inscription. It's imperfect, messy, unclear, and yet it's enough. It's a legacy of flavor, clumsily yet lovingly etched into clay. You glance out the window. The light has shifted again, warmer now, casting soft shadows across the courtyard. Someone is shouting about onions. A scribe drops a tablet. A fish escapes from a jar. The kitchen hums with life, and somewhere amid the confusion, a new recipe is being born, half memory, half guesswork, all heart. And as you leave the scribe's table, your fingertips still dusted with clay, you realize this wasn't a place for perfect instructions. It was a place for edible stories. The kitchen smells different today. There's an edge in the air, a little more sourness than usual, maybe from over-fermented barley or a forgotten pot of lentils left on the fire too long. The mood is slightly tenser too. Cooks are hunched, over their fires more protectively. Apprentices move faster. Scribes are scribbling without their usual chatter. Something's up. You approach the central hearth, where a large bronze cauldron is heating slowly over a triangular stack of tamarisk logs. Inside the pot, river fish, caught this morning. Around it, a crowd of silent cooks trying very hard not to glance at a stone-faced temple inspector, now making his way around the kitchen with the solemn gravity of a tax collector with indigestion. He lifts a ladle, sniffs, frowns, then says one word: too much salt. The entire room freezes. No, one breathes. Somewhere in the back, a bowl clatters to the ground. The inspector turns and walks out without another word. You blink. That's it? The head cook, who had been quietly gripping the edge of the work table so hard his knuckles went white, finally exhales. We're all doomed, he mutters. And thus, you've just witnessed a culinary crime in ancient Mesopotamia, a dish oversalted in a temple kitchen. It might not sound like much to modern ears, but in this world, it could mean the difference between favour and drought, between a smooth calendar year and the gods throwing a metaphorical lightning bolt at your barley crops. Oversalting food wasn't just a taste offence, it was an offering offence. You had violated the balance expected by the divine. It was seen as imprecise, careless, even disrespectful. And that, in a society where temple kitchens were the stage for sacred communication, was not a small deal. You lean against a stack of old grain sacks and ask an apprentice what happens next. Well, he says grimly, we redo the whole thing. New fish, new broth, new herbs, and the scribe has to rewrite the offering tablet to match. You glance across the room and see the poor scribe in question already scraping his stylus across the wet clay, muttering something that definitely sounds like it would get him kicked out of scribe school. But this scene raises a bigger question. Were there actual punishments for bad cooking? The answer is complicated. In many temple kitchens, especially those of high-ranking cities like Nippur, or Babylon, cooking errors, especially those related to offerings, could indeed be treated seriously. The cooks were held to a higher standard, not only because they were feeding priests and officials, but because they were feeding gods. If your dish came out wrong, it wasn't just a failed recipe, it was a bad omen. Records don't explicitly list what punishments were handed out for specific cooking mistakes, but we do have examples of general food mismanagement leading to demotion, exile from the temple kitchens, or being reassigned to less desirable jobs, like latrine duty, or worse, scribe training, which in itself could be a punishment if you had no talent for stylus work. One story survives, possibly apocryphal, of a cook who used spoiled onions in a stew for the moon god Nana. The result? A string of sleepless nights across the temple. The priests blamed the unrest on a disturbed divine appetite. The cook was reportedly sent to work in the temple's lowest level storeroom, organizing moldy barley sacks by moonlight. Whether, or not that story's true doesn't even matter. The important thing is, people believed it could happen. The fear was real. Cooking wasn't just domestic work, it was divine protocol, and it had consequences. You glance around the kitchen, noticing the small behaviors you hadn't seen before. How the apprentices double-check every handful of herbs. How the cooks taste broth in silence, nodding only when the flavor feels right. How the scribes watch, poised to amend their notes if even a single ingredient changes. There's another, story told in whispers, about a tavern keeper in Sippar who undercooked fish during a festival. A few people got sick. One priest collapsed during ritual. For weeks afterward, people refused to eat fish from that quarter. The tavern eventually closed. The fishmonger who supplied her lost 3 of his boats in a canal flood. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the gods had no patience for salmonella. It all begs the question, how did they enforce food quality in a world without thermometers, timers, or health inspectors? The answer: trust, repetition, and fear of divine retribution. You walk over to the herb table, where a very nervous young cook is remeasuring salt with the care of someone defusing a bomb. He explains that they typically use a 2-finger pinch per cauldron, a unit of measurement passed down by hand, not stylus. It's not precise, but it's intuitive. Too much, and the stew becomes bitter. Too little, and the gods might not notice the offering. The right amount? That's balance. That's skill. That's survival. You ask if anyone's ever deliberately messed up a recipe, maybe to protest something, or as a kind of ancient sabotage. He chuckles softly. Once. An apprentice replaced coriander with crushed mustard seeds, on purpose. The result was so spicy, half the kitchen started coughing. The high priest thought it was a curse. That apprentice is now sweeping temple courtyards. So yes, kitchen justice existed, and it was swift, but not all food crimes were punished harshly. Sometimes, if a dish was salvageable, or if the priest was in a good mood, a small bribe might smooth things over. A jar of date wine here, a little extra incense there, a promise to rewrite the recipe correctly and triple-check the leaks next time. Even in ancient temples, the line between ritual and bureaucracy was negotiable. One of the head cooks walks by and sighs. "We're redoing the fish stew," he says without emotion. Again, this time without Enki's personal salt mine, in the pot. The rest of the kitchen chuckles, nervously. You follow the process now with new eyes. You watch as new fish are cleaned, chopped, and placed gently into a pot of fresh, unsalted broth. You see the herbs remeasured, the garlic carefully crushed, the vinegar added drop by drop instead of splashed in. And finally, when the salt arrives, it's added with the slow motion of a priest anointing an idol. The scribe rewrites the tablet. Fish, boiled in water, seasoned lightly. Add herbs, add salt to balance, serve warm. You ask him about the word balance. He nods. It's a newer addition. Before we just said add salt. Now we say balance. The gods like balance. Maybe we all do. And then, the moment of truth. The inspector returns. He lifts the ladle, tastes, waits, nods, and leaves. The kitchen breathes again. You lean back against the wall, watching steam rise from the pot, and realize something profound. In this world, taste wasn't just flavor, it was meaning. It was metaphor. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was a signal that you cared, that you paid attention, that you respected the chain of tradition stretching back to the first cook who ever dared boil a pot for the gods. And maybe, just maybe, your own kitchen crimes, burnt toast, underseasoned soup, forgotten tea bags, don't seem quite so bad now. At least no one's assigning you to courtyard sweeping duty. The temple kitchens may have been sacred, rule-bound, and carefully observed. But across the dusty alley, behind a reed curtain stained with years of smoke and fish oil, is an entirely different world. One where the rules are looser, the flavors louder, and the gods take a back seat to the growl in your stomach. You've found yourself at the edge of a royal banquet, and things are about to get deliciously out of hand. The royal palace in a city like Nippur or Babylon wasn't just a political hub, it was a center of display, prestige, and edible theater. And the best way to show off? A feast. Not just for kings and queens, but for military leaders, visiting merchants, temple dignitaries, and sometimes, if the gods were in a good mood, a favored scribe or two. Today's banquet isn't an ordinary affair. It's the third day of the Spring Renewal Festival, when fields are ploughed, livestock are paraded, and the ruling family hosts an enormous glittering dinner to thank the gods and remind everyone exactly who's in charge. You're led past stone columns and into a wide courtyard ringed with polished benches. The tables are low and sprawling, covered in linen cloths, fresh-cut reeds, and polished clayware that glints in the sunlight. Bronze serving trays shimmer like sun-heated mirrors. and the aroma. It's overwhelming. Roasted meat, dried fruit simmering in honey, flatbreads stacked high and steaming. A tang of vinegar and herbs lingers in the air, undercut by the subtle sweetness of fermented dates, and somewhere nearby, someone has definitely spilled a jug of beer, judging by the stickiness under your sandals. The first dish to arrive is carried by two servants in deep blue tunics, a roast of 4 meats, carved and arranged like a sculpture, of abundance. There's goat, of course, crisped at the edges and rubbed with coriander and crushed cumin. There's lamb, seared with thick fat that pools at the bottom of the dish like gold. Next to that, roast duck, slathered with a pomegranate, glaze, and finally, something rare. Wild boar, its hide scored and charred, exuding the smoky scent of tamarisk wood. You realize quickly that this isn't a meal, it's a declaration. Meat in ancient Mesopotamia was not an everyday luxury. For commoners, it was rare, a festive treat if you were lucky. For temple staff, it was mostly reserved for offerings. But for the palace, it was theatre. The more kinds of meat you could serve at once, the more wealth and power you displayed. A single roast with 4 animals. That's like rolling out the red carpet made entirely of bacon. You take a seat, and almost immediately, a servant offers you a hand-washing bowl scented with crushed mint and thyme. Another brings you a cup of dark, thick beer. The texture is almost chewable, gritty, fermented, probably alive, but somehow still good. The royal brewers don't play around. Then comes the second course. Stuffed dates and cheese parcels, wrapped in fig leaves and warmed gently over stones. The filling is soft, tangy, spiced with cinnamon bark and sesame. You bite into one and immediately understand why even scribes used to write poetry about date palms. This is dessert, masquerading as an appetizer, and it's working. Around you the feast buzzes. Nobles debate harvest forecasts and trade routes. Priests murmur about omens. A general boasts about the condition of his horses. You, meanwhile, are debating whether to go for seconds or wait for the next dish. But before you can decide, it arrives. Fish in sour tamarind sauce, laid whole on a platter, garnished with pounded leek and fresh cilantro. The fish itself is river-caught, oily and tender, and the sauce is sharp enough to wake the dead. You try a bite and are immediately wide awake. This is followed by barley cakes fried in clarified butter, and small bowls of pickled turnips that make your eyes water in the best way. You notice there's no cutlery here. Most guests eat with fingers or with flatbread used as a scoop, and frankly, it's more satisfying that way. There's a rhythm to the feast, not just in the courses, but in the ritual of seating. You've been placed at a middle-tier table, not quite in the shadows, but definitely not near the king, and that matters. In Mesopotamian banquet culture, your seat was a message. The closer to the host, the higher your perceived importance. The farther away, well, hope you enjoy the pickled onions. Historians still argue how rigid these social layers were. Some believe seatings were fixed by caste, profession, and birth. Others think banquets were more fluid, determined by who brought the best gifts or had the freshest gossip. What's clear is that where you sat determined what you ate, how much you drank, and who you were allowed to speak to. Your table neighbor, a slightly tipsy grain merchant with hands like shovels, leans in and whispers, "If you ever get invited to the first bench, don't. Too close to the king. You get watched too closely. No second helpings." Good to know. The fourth course arrives and silences the entire room. Honey-glazed locust skewers with preserved apricots. This is a delicacy that even royals reserve for special occasions. The locusts are crunchy, slightly smoky, and balanced by the tart sweetness of the fruit. You try not to think about legs as you chew. Your eyes drift to the scribes seated at a small corner table, rapidly taking notes. But they're not writing recipes. They're recording who's seated where, what was served, who talked to whom, and most importantly, what everyone gifted to the king. A banquet wasn't just a feast, it was a political ledger. The food, that was just the gravy. And there was plenty of that too. You glance up and see the king himself now rising. He doesn't speak, doesn't toast. He simply nods, and the final course is brought forward. A giant sweetbread pyramid, glazed in date, syrup and garnished with crushed pistachios. It's absurd. It's excessive. It's a monument to carbs. And as you take a bite, sweet, dense, spiced with something vaguely resembling nutmeg, you realize the banquet has worked. You feel full, awed, and just the tiniest bit frightened by how much power is displayed in every roasted duck, every drop of date wine. But most importantly, you're reminded of this. In Mesopotamia, food wasn't personal. It was public theatre. There was no such thing as a private meal at this level. Every bite you took was noticed, measured, ranked. Eating was part of politics, part of ritual, part of warfare. And if you left hungry, it wasn't a mistake. It was a message. The sun dips low behind the palace wall. Lamps are lit. Someone strums a stringed instrument in the corner. The feast winds down, not with dessert, but with silence. Full bellies, half-drained beer jugs, fingers sticky with date syrup and grease. You rise slowly, your stomach heavier, but your mind even more so. Because tonight, you didn't just eat like royalty. You learned that food here is never just food, it's language. And tonight, the message was clear. This king, he knows how to serve. The royal feast lingers in your memory like a dream. Warm, gluttonous, rich with garlic and prestige. But the next morning, well, let's just say the palace didn't pack leftovers for you. Your stomach groans slightly as you wander back through the morning mist rising over Nipper's winding alleys. The temple kitchens are already roaring again. Someone's banging a copper pot against a rock to loosen stuck lentils, and a goat has escaped and is currently enjoying its brief taste of freedom by knocking over herb baskets. But today, you're not headed back into sacred kitchens or royal courtyards. No, this morning, you turn into a smaller, grimier alley tucked between a scribe school and a fishmonger's hut, and find yourself standing before a small awning made from stitched reed. Mats, there's a fire pit nearby, a hanging pot bubbling ominously, and an older woman sitting cross-legged beside a crate of dried plums. She looks up at you, squints, and gestures vaguely toward a flat slab of bread sizzling on a heated clay disc. You've found it. Street food, Mesopotamian style. It doesn't smell divine. It doesn't sparkle with pomegranate glaze or wear a crown of pistachios. But it's real, honest, a little burnt, and you're already halfway in love with it. The woman, she tells you to call her Daya, scoops up the flatbread with a bent bronze spatula and hands it to you wrapped in what appears to be old reed paper. Inside the bread, crushed dates, soft, lentils, a hint of mint, and a generous smear of fermented cheese. It's hot, it's messy, and it's absolutely phenomenal. You take a bite and immediately cough. Too much sour cheese. Daya chuckles and mutters something that probably translates to "you'll survive." This is street food with a side of dust, and it tells a different story than the polished recipes of palace feasts or temple offerings. It's the food of people on the move. Merchants, guards, harried scribes, hungry children with sticky fingers, and no concept of "wait your turn." Historians used to assume that ancient Mesopotamia lacked true street food culture, mostly because clay tablets don't detail it. But that's not entirely fair. Street vendors rarely write their own history. They just feed the people writing it. Still, records from city inventories, grain rations, and rare court cases offer clues. We know about small roadside stalls near temple complexes. We know about beer houses that doubled as taverns, kitchens, and social clubs. And we know about the popularity of certain mobile foods. Honey cakes, boiled locusts, fried onion dumplings, and something translated, somewhat ominously, as sour fish paste wrapped in green. You're hoping Daya isn't serving that today. Instead, she gestures to a second pot, now bubbling with what looks like beans? Chickpeas? You can't tell. She sprinkles in a handful of something white, salt or dried cheese, and spoons the mixture onto a bowl made of folded palm leaf. She offers it to you with a flat, dry smile. You try it. It's gritty, a little smoky, tangy, with a weirdly crunchy texture from what might be toasted barley. But it's oddly comforting, like someone tried to make hummus with no blender and a lot of anger. This is survival food, and it works. You glance around and notice a few other vendors now stirring to life. One woman is arranging dried fish on a heated slate. A boy next to her is boiling small eggs in beer. Another vendor is shaving slices of pickled turnip onto bread and handing them out for copper bits. No recipes, no tablets, just instinct and repetition. You ask Daya how long she's been cooking here. She shrugs. Since the king had teeth. You take that to mean a very long time. She explains that many vendors, especially women, operated stalls inherited through families. If a mother knew how to season lentils just right, that knowledge passed to her daughters or sons without ever touching clay. Some even had secret blends of herbs, known only within the household, stored in cloth bundles that never left the kitchen hut. These weren't just recipes, they were family legacies. Daya pulls out a small jar from under her mat. It's ceramic, sealed with wax. She breaks the seal and lets you smell it. Crushed coriander, dried lemon zest, mint, maybe something floral, like crushed rose petal. It's intoxicating. She sprinkles a pinch onto a chickpea patty, fries it in a dab of sheep's fat, and hands it to you without a word. You take a bite. Your teeth sink through the crisp edge into a soft, spiced interior that tastes like the end of winter and the promise of spring. Sweet, salty, bitter, and sharp, all at once. You're stunned. Daya smiles. My mother's mix. She tells you it's called gugulu, though you can't find that word in any of the tablets you've seen. And that's the point. Not everything survives through clay. Some flavors live only through mouths and hands and memory. You sit beside her for a while, watching the city wake up. A merchant yells at a donkey. A scribe drops his stylus in a puddle. A woman buys honeycakes for her. 3 kids and yells when they immediately drop them in the dust. It's chaotic, messy, beautiful. You realize that street food tells a different kind of history. Not the grand inscribed stories of kings and priests, but the daily hunger of ordinary people. The way someone eats when they've only got 2 copper bits and 6 minutes before they're expected back at the ziggurat. It's food that fuels errands, food that fuels gossip, food that fuels the very idea of a city. Historians still debate whether certain dishes originated in temples and trickled down to the streets, or whether the streets were always one step ahead, inventing new flavors too fast for scribes to keep up. Probably a bit of both. You watch as Daya prepares a new batch of honeycakes, balls of dough rolled in sesame, fried crisp and drizzled with syrup, boiled down from dates and fig mash. She says nothing as she works. Her hands know what to do. The recipe lives in her fingers. You buy 2. They're crispy on the outside, molten within, and absolutely life-changing. You have no words. Daya just grins. That one, she says, is for the gods. You're not sure if she means the cake or you, but you're grateful either way. You stand, dusting off your tunic. Your feet are sticky. Your breath smells like fried onions and honey. And your heart is somehow lighter, because in this crowded, smoky corner of Nippur, you've tasted the part of Mesopotamian cuisine that never needed a tablet to survive. It lived in the mouths of the people, and now it lives in you. The smoke from Daya's fire clings to your clothes like a culinary souvenir. As you make your way back through Nippur's narrow lanes, the early morning sun filters through low clouds, casting a honey-colored glow on every surface. The city is stirring. You pass a weaver shouting about yarn prices, a child carrying a suspiciously large frog, and a man trying to convince a group of very unimpressed goats to move out of the road. But you're heading back toward the temples again. This Time not for stew or scribes or sacred garlic, but to get a closer look at something that rarely gets much love in food history. The oven, or more precisely, the many ways that fire, clay, ash, and time came together to cook in a world without knobs, gauges, timers, or the luxury of even temperature. You step into the temple's secondary courtyard, where two cooks are already elbow-deep in sticky dough. In front of them is a strange dome-shaped structure, with a narrow opening at the bottom and a blackened mouth at the top, like a sleeping monster that burps heat. This, you learn, is a tanner, one of Mesopotamia's oldest cooking tools. Part oven, part fire pit, part life partner. The tanner was the beating heart of most Mesopotamian kitchens. Shaped like an upright clay cone with a hollow center, it was loaded with tamarisk, or date palm twigs at the base, set ablaze and allowed to burn until the inner walls glowed with heat. After that, you could slap bread dough onto the hot sides, or lower a pot into the center, or use the base as a slow-cooking ash bed. If you were brave, and maybe just a little reckless, you could do all three at once. The cook standing beside the tanner gestures for you to come closer. His name is Bazi, and his arms are dusted with flour, his hands calloused from years of battling fire. He's preparing emmer flatbreads, made from a coarse dough mixed with ground chickpeas, a little water, a splash of date syrup, and a wild yeast starter that smells somewhere between ancient socks and promising fermentation. With practiced hands, Bazi rolls the dough into thin discs and slaps each one onto the inner wall of the oven. The sizzle is instant. The bread sticks. It takes about 90 seconds, no timer needed, for the surface to bubble and brown. Then he peels it off with a hooked reed stick and tosses it into a basket. You catch one and tear it open. Steam spills out. It's chewy, slightly nutty, with a hint of burnt smoke. You could eat 5, and that's when the second oven catches your eye. Not a tanur, but a tabun, shorter, wider, and buried halfway in the ground. This one is used more for slow roasting or baking in covered pots. A young assistant is currently nestling a clay pot of lentils into the bed of hot ash inside. Another pot, flat and lidded, is cooking onion-stuffed rolls wrapped in fig leaves. The smells are overwhelming, earthy, humid, slightly sweet. You squat beside the oven and feel the radiant heat against your shins. There's no fire visible now, just the thick, almost living heat that stays trapped inside the clay like a coiled beast. This kind of cooking is all about timing, feel, and intuition. No knobs, no dials, no mercy. Bazi explains that cooking here is as much about managing cooling curves as it is about raw heat. First, you stoke the flames to full blast. Then you cook the thin stuff, bread, small skewers, light roasts. As the fire dies, you lower in the stews, the pottages, the lentils. Finally, hours later, you bury the slow roast dishes in the embers. For the overnight cook, it's a method born of necessity, but refined by repetition. You ask him how they know when something's ready. He shrugs. The smell, the sound, the crack in the crust. It sounds vague, but then again, so does every great cook you've ever met. In the corner, another assistant tends to the ash cooking. He's just finished wrapping a fish in lotus, leaves tied with flax cord and buried in the warm embers. No direct flame, no pot, just ember heat. He marks the spot with a charred stick. 2 hours from now, the fish will be soft, flaky, and infused with the scent of wood, leaf, and patience. You turn to another corner of the courtyard, where a larger clay construction squats like a baked potato. This is the mud brick oven, used more for bulk cooking, like bean stews, large cuts of meat, or baking rows of flatbread for festivals. Right now, it's being used to roast a dozen onion-stuffed lamb hearts, a delicacy you didn't know you needed until the smell hit you in the soul. The oven door, made of mud straw clay and sealed with an ash paste, is opened briefly, and a wave of meaty herbal air escapes. It's dizzying. The cook grabs a hot stone, taps the side of the roasting pot, listens for the echo, then nods. Still needs 10 more minutes. You marvel at the language of heat here. It's not just fire, it's rhythm, timing, habit, and instinct. Each oven tells a different story. Each fire has its own personality. And every cook here knows that mastering the oven isn't just about not burning dinner. It's about tuning yourself to a living, breathing kitchen that doesn't come with instructions. Historians still debate how standardized these ovens were across Mesopotamia. Some believe tanners were widespread, especially in domestic settings. Others argue that large mud brick ovens were mostly temple and palace fare. There's even debate over whether some of these methods came from older Sumerian traditions, or were adopted from nearby cultures like the Elamites. But the one thing everyone agrees on, fire changed everything. The introduction of clay ovens and the shift from open-pit fires to controlled cooking chambers was a culinary revolution. It allowed for more complex dishes, longer stews, better breads, and more consistent textures. It made hospitality possible on a larger scale. It let cities grow around not just trade and temples, but smoke and dough. You sit back as the lentil pot is removed from the tabun. The lid is cracked. Inside, steam billows up, carrying the smell of garlic, onions, crushed coriander, and something deeper, maybe tamarind paste or reduced fig juice. You're handed a spoon made from fired clay, and you take a bite. It's soft, savory, a little tangy. The lentils melt. The herbs linger. The aftertaste hums like an old lullaby. The cook says nothing. He doesn't have to, because this is the quiet power of clay, fire, and patience. And as the ovens roar, and the pots bubble, and the bread rises and falls like breath, you realize, in a world where writing was sacred and food was divine, heat was the language they trusted most. The aroma of roasted lentils and charred onions still clings to your hair as you step away from the warmth of the ovens. A soft breeze threads through the temple courtyard, stirring the clay dust and flickering the shadows cast by the tall mud brick walls. Somewhere in the distance, a flute plays a sleepy melody, and you think, maybe for the first time all day, you could actually fall asleep standing up, but you don't. Because you've just spotted something curious happening at the far edge of the courtyard. 3 men and a donkey stand around a cart. The cart is loaded not with grain or pottery, but with something more precious. Small, hard bundles wrapped in cloth and sealed in waxed leather pouches. A guard checks a list. A priest nods approvingly, and one of the men carefully lifts a package and cradles it like a newborn. You inch closer and ask what's inside. Salt, the priest says simply, as if it should be obvious. And suddenly, you realize, this isn't just a spice delivery. It's an event. In ancient Mesopotamia, salt was more than seasoning. It was wealth. It was currency. It was power. And in many ways, it was the first ingredient you couldn't live without, literally and politically. Today, the temple kitchens are buzzing, not because of a new recipe or a visiting dignitary, but because the latest shipment from the northern salt mines has finally arrived. The cooks had been rationing for weeks, relying on dried herbs, bitter greens, and fish sauces to bring flavor to the food. But now, with the arrival of fresh, crystalline white salt, it's as if a festival has begun. You follow the donkey cart as it's rolled into the storage room. The sacks are counted, weighed, and opened under the watchful eyes of both a priest and a scribe, who notes the delivery in 2 separate ledgers. One for temple records, one for the kitchen. Salt isn't just a spice, it's an accountable asset. You crouch beside the open pouch and pinch a bit between your fingers. The crystals are coarse, irregular, slightly damp from the humidity. You taste a grain, sharp, mineral, briny, and more powerful than any spice in the room. Why? Because salt didn't just enhance flavor, it preserved life. Before refrigeration, salt was the only reliable way to keep food from spoiling. It dried meat, cured fish, pickled vegetables, and stabilized dairy. It was the unsung hero of every meal you've tasted so far, and the reason those meals existed in the first place. And yet it was rare, scarce, valuable. Mesopotamia itself had no coastal access and limited natural salt deposits. Most of the salt came from long, dangerous trade routes, transported via donkey caravans, raft convoys, or overland merchants who risked everything for those pale white crystals. Some came from the Iranian plateau, others from the northern deserts. It passed through dozens of hands, each taking a portion, each inflating its price. Historians estimate that salt was so valuable, it was often counted in rations alongside silver and barley. Workers might receive a daily salt portion as part of their pay. Soldiers carried it. Priests used it in purification rituals. And cooks prayed it didn't run out. You watch now as the head cook measures out the day's portion. Only a few scoops, carefully weighed, no spilling. It will be divided among several dishes and probably stretched to its limit. Every grain matters. You ask how they use salt in recipes. He explains with the solemnity of a philosopher. Not at the beginning, not all at once. It waits. You add it when the pot listens. It's a metaphor, sure, but you understand. Salt wasn't just about taste, it was about timing. Add it too soon and the meat toughens. Too late and the flavors never marry. It had to come at the right moment, like the punchline of a joke or the final drumbeat of a song. And sometimes, salt didn't even go into the food. It was used on the cook. In certain temple rituals, cooks anointed their hands with salt before preparing sacred offerings. It was believed to purify the touch, to bless the meal. Salt could also be sprinkled across thresholds, poured into fire pits, or mixed with water for ceremonial cleansing. It was flavor and filter, earth and divine. A young apprentice nearby drops a pinch of salt onto a small bowl of sour barley porridge, tastes it, and closes his eyes. You try it too. It's transformative. The porridge goes from stale to rich, from bland to somehow nostalgic. It reminds you of warm kitchens and tired hands and quiet mornings. All from one grain. You ask the scribe about the word for salt in Akkadian. Esemu, he says. But sometimes it's just written as white stone. Depends who's writing it. He flips through his ledger and shows you a line. 3 bowls of lentils, 1 loaf of bread, 1 pinch of white stone. It reads like a shopping list and a poem all at once. And then, almost as quickly as it arrived, the salt is gone, distributed into pots, kneaded into dough, dissolved into broths, absorbed into fish scales and date sauces. It vanishes into the day's cooking without ceremony, without fanfare. But its absence would be noticed immediately. You sit by the fire pit and watch as the next dish is prepared. Boiled turnips in sour vinegar, finished with a single pinch of salt. It's peasant food, simple, humble. But today, it feels regal. The salt wakes up the turnips, tempers the vinegar, makes the dish shine. No pomegranate glaze, no duck fat, just salt. And for a moment, you realize this is the backbone of Mesopotamian flavor. Not garlic, not coriander, not beer or lamb or bread, but salt. Historians still debate whether salt's cultural value came first from its role in preservation or from its scarcity. Some argue that it became spiritual because it was expensive. Others believe the opposite, that its spiritual weight made it expensive, maybe both. In a world shaped by trade, faith, and taste, it was likely impossible to separate the sacred from the savory. You return to the scribe, who hands you a small clay seal. It's engraved with the symbol of the kitchen. A bowl, a fire, a grain. You turn it over. On the back, someone has scratched a single cuneiform sign, the word for salt. You smile, then tuck the seal into your pouch and walk toward the sound of someone shouting that the lentils are burning. Some things never change. You're back in the archives again, not the grand temple archives with their towering clay shelves and stern-faced priests cataloguing omens and tax records. No, this one's smaller. A side room tucked behind the main storerooms, half lit by a flickering oil lamp and smelling faintly of roasted grains and ink. You duck beneath a hanging reed curtain and find yourself face to face with a wall stacked high with recipe tablets. Except, calling them recipes might be generous. You squint at one that's recently been set out to dry. Its surface is still soft, and the symbols press deep and confident, like the scribe knew exactly what they were writing. But the contents? Take meat, add water, fat, garlic, leek, boil, remove scum, stir, serve. That's it. You blink, waiting for more. A second line, a note about quantity, maybe some helpful reminder about not poisoning yourself. Nothing. And suddenly it hits you. This isn't a recipe. It's a memory fragment, a sketch, an edible haiku. You pick up another tablet, same pattern. Boil, chop, stir, repeat. Ingredients, listed with no quantities. Actions described with no timing. No temperature. No instructions on what vessel to use. Just verbs and nouns. The cooking equivalent of someone shouting, "Car, road, drive, go." You sit down cross-legged on the reed, mat floor, letting your fingers trace the cuneiform indentations. These tablets, the famed Yale culinary tablets and others like them, have confounded historians for decades. Revered as the earliest known written recipes, they're tantalizing in what they reveal, and infuriating in what they don't. Scholars still argue whether these clay tablets were intended for cooks at all. Were they ever actually used in a kitchen? Or were they scribal exercises, like a homework sheet for junior apprentices learning verbs? You glance up as an elderly scribe enters, shuffling with the deliberate slowness of someone who's been writing garlic instructions for 40 years. His name is Nabu Nasir, and he's in charge of overseeing the culinary archive. He sets down a stack of tablets, sighs, and begins talking without being asked. "These aren't for cooks," he mutters, "more to the shelf than to you. Cooks don't read Akkadian. They taste, they feel, they stir. These," he waves a hand at the tablets, "are for the records, for the gods, and for the next scribe." You nod slowly. So the recipes weren't meant to guide. They were meant to preserve, which raises the next big question. Preserve what? The dish, the ingredients, the ritual of preparation, or just the idea of the meal? Take, for example, one tablet that simply reads lamb, water, onion, garlic, blood, cook, strain, offer. You look at Nabu Nasir. "Is that a stew?" He chuckles. "It's an offering. It may never have been eaten, or it may have been a sacred broth, or it could just be a fancy word for what you make after a sacrifice." That's the thing. These tablets don't explain themselves. They assume the reader already knows what the dish is supposed to look like, taste like, even feel like. They aren't written for strangers. They're reminders, like jotting "Grandma's meat thing with the cinnamon" in a notebook and expecting someone 3,000 years later to understand what you meant. And yet, somehow, we try. Modern chefs and archaeologists have spent years attempting to recreate these dishes, using the limited instructions, sourcing ancient grains, boiling meats with leeks and onions, and trying to taste history. Some recreations are surprisingly delicious. Others are bland, confusing, or just plain weird. And every version is speculative, because the tablets don't tell you what you're missing. You ask Nabu Nasir why they left out quantities. He raises an eyebrow. "Because we knew them. Why write 2 onions when every cook already knew how many? If you say meat in broth with garlic, the cook knows which pot, which ladle, which fire. They don't need your numbers. They need your memory." It makes sense, but it also makes you laugh. These recipe tablets are everything modern recipes aren't. There's no intro paragraph, no prep time, no serves for, no substitute for leeks if you're allergic, no vegan version, just a line of text and the assumption that if you're reading it, you're already in the club. You pick up another tablet, older, cracked in, too. It says, stew of 7 fires. Add wild onion, vinegar, bones of the bird, fat of the goat. Reduce. You point to it. 7 fires? Ah, Nabu Nasir smiles. The poetic ones. That probably means it was stirred or reheated 7 times. Or maybe 7 people tended the fire. Or maybe the fire was fed 7 woods. Or maybe it was just a nice number. You sigh. Poetic ambiguity aside, you're struck by something else. The consistency. Across dozens of tablets, across different cities and centuries, the ingredients barely change. Onions, leeks, garlic, fat, lamb, beer, barley, vinegar, occasionally spices, coriander, mint, cumin, always familiar, always repetitive. Like a cultural signature encoded in soup. You flip through more tablets. There's one for blood sausage made with barley and herbs, another for fish stew with sour beer and leek paste, a third that might be a type of date cake, though it only says crushed fruit, fat, cook until firm. It's not much, but it's something. You realize these recipes, however incomplete, are the world's oldest culinary time machine. Not because they tell you what to cook, but because they assume you already know. They hint at a world where cooking wasn't written down, it was passed down, where memory mattered more than ink, where the only reason to write it was to honor it, to mark it, to whisper, this mattered. And maybe 4,000 years from now, someone will find your great-grandmother's handwritten lasagna instructions. Just sauce, noodles, cheese, bake until it smells done. And feel the same way. Because recipes are never just instructions, they're fossils of flavor, shards of identity, love letters written in grease and garlic and ink. You leave the archive room carrying one small tablet, your favorite so far. It says only meat, onion, fat, garlic, water, serve hot. It's vague, it's bare. It's almost insulting in its lack of detail, but somehow it feels perfect. You tuck it into your satchel and smile. After all, you don't need the instructions anymore. You've already tasted it. You've wandered through sacred temple kitchens, sipped beer soup at dawn, crouched beside glowing clay ovens, and even endured the fury of a head cook over one poorly salted fish. You've chewed on history wrapped in fig leaves, stuffed your face with honey cakes on the street, and decoded cryptic stew tablets that told you almost nothing and yet somehow everything. But today you have dessert on your mind. You step into the outer courtyard of the temple again, where the evening breeze carries the distinct smell of something sweet wafting from a low fire, not overpowering like pomegranate glaze or the thick date. Molasses you had at the banquet. No, this is subtler. Warm, caramelized, slightly smoky, and unmistakably sugary. You follow your nose to a small group of cooks clustered around a heated stone slab. They're busy stirring something in a shallow bronze pan. It bubbles gently. Beside them sits a large woven basket of dates, already pitted and crushed into sticky mounds. And stacked neatly nearby are small bowls carved from hardened fig bark. Someone hands you one, warm and soft, topped with a glistening swirl of the bubbling sauce. It smells of roasted fruit and nut paste, with just a whisper of cinnamon bark and dried lemon peel. This, says the young cook proudly, is palusha imri, the cake of dates. You bite in. It's dense, soft, deeply sweet, with a chewy bite and a syrupy edge that clings to your tongue. You blink. This is good. Very good. Possibly the best thing you've tasted so far in Mesopotamia. And yet, when you ask to see the recipe tablet, the cook shrugs and points you to a cracked piece of clay that reads only, take dates, mash, mix with fat, bake or boil, serve warm. That's it. Wait, you say. Is it baked or boiled? He shrugs. Depends. On what? On how hungry you are. You stare at him. He grins. And just like that, you've entered the realm of the Sumerian, Dessert debate. Historians and food archaeologists have puzzled for years over this specific sweet, palusha imri. It appears on several clay tablets, but the instructions are maddeningly vague. Some translations imply it was a cake, baked in the ash or on a hot flat stone. Others suggest it was boiled, more like a sweet pudding or dense dumpling. And one particularly stubborn theory argues that it wasn't cooked at all, just mashed, spiced and eaten like ancient date energy bars. You try a second bite of the one in your bowl. The outer edge has a slight crust, like it's been briefly grilled or seared. But the inside is unmistakably soft and pudding-like. Maybe it's both. The cook explains that his mother used to prepare it by forming the date fat mixture into small discs, wrapping them in fig leaves, and placing them near the edge of the tanner oven, not inside it, but just close enough to capture the heat. They would slowly firm up over several hours, taking on the smoke and earthiness of the fire, without burning. But, he says, my grandmother used to boil them, wrapped in cloth, like dumplings. She said baking made them too dry, and just like that, you see it. Culinary memory diverging along family lines. It's not a debate about right or wrong. It's about method, texture, time, and which grandmother you liked more. You start asking around. One older scribe says his household preferred the boiled version, flavored with beer and crushed nuts, served at the end of a long fasts. A priest insists the proper way is to bake it with a pinch of ground sesame and let it sit overnight until it hardens like a biscuit. A temple baker, who's already eaten two while you were talking, swears that both are wrong and that real palu is fried in clarified butter and sprinkled with rose water. You're beginning to realize that this dessert, this humble, sticky date mash, isn't just a dish. It's a cultural anchor, something small and sweet that every household touched differently. You could tell a city by how it treated its date cakes. You could read someone's lineage in the spices they chose. You dig a little deeper, literally. A young apprentice shows you how they pit the dates. First, by pressing them through a flat stone grater, then boiling the mash to separate the syrup from the fibre. The syrup is saved for drinks or sauces. The mash gets mixed with ground emmer, sheep fat, nuts, if you're lucky, and fragrant spices. The most common are cinnamon bark, coriander seed, and sometimes dried orange peel, though that last one is usually reserved for richer tables. The resulting mixture is pressed into small forms, discs, domes, or even little pyramids. Some are served immediately. Others are dried in the sun and stored for later. You're told that workers at the ziggurat often carried dried date cakes wrapped in palm leaves as their lunch, dense, sugary, and loaded with enough calories to fuel a day of hauling stone. You remember Dyer's honey cakes on the street, and the glazed date sweets served at the royal feast, and the syrup-simmered fruit that was spooned over beer soup for breakfast. Dates weren't just dessert in Mesopotamia. They were the foundation of sweetness. Sugarcane wouldn't arrive in the region for many centuries. Honey was expensive, hard to store, and mostly reserved for temples or the upper class. But dates? Dates grew in abundance. The palms shaded every canal, lined every field, dropped fruit for free. They were chopped, boiled, mashed, dried, pressed, and fermented, made into vinegar, turned into wine, melted into syrups. They were fed to animals, to children, to gods. They were sweet enough to end a meal, but nourishing enough to begin one. The Akkadian word for date, imru, appears across thousands of tablets, not just in recipes, but in contracts, payments, offerings. You could pay temple tax in dates. You could settle debts with baskets of pressed cakes. You could even offer dates to the sick as part of healing rituals. One priest tells you that the goddess Inanna was said to favor dates above all other fruit, that the date palm was a symbol of her generosity, that lovers would exchange date cakes in her honor during certain festivals, especially the soft ones, he says with a wink. Boiled, not baked, much more romantic. You pretend not to, blush. By late afternoon, you're back in the temple courtyard, sitting beside the date fire again. The air is thick with sweetness. Another batch is cooling. You watch as a young girl presses a small thumbprint into the top of each finished cake before stacking them on a clay tray. Why the thumbprint, you ask? So we know it's homemade, she says, and you smile. Because suddenly, that feels like the most beautiful answer in the world. Not every recipe needs to be perfect. Not every dessert needs to impress. Sometimes, a thumbprint is enough. You take another bite, and the whole city melts away. The sky above Nippur shifts to a mellow amber as the sun dips low on the horizon. The temple kitchens are winding down, but the courtyard still hums with quiet motion. A broom sweeps away lentil husks near the tabboon. Bread scraps are tossed to birds. A cracked pot, too warped to keep, is ceremonially shattered by an apprentice. More dramatic than necessary, but he clearly enjoys the flair. You, meanwhile, are standing before a shelf of clay tablets again. Not in the archives this time, but in the open, where the kitchen scribes store their most used food logs. And as your eyes scan the rows of signs, you notice something odd, something missing. You tilt your head. Where are the chefs' names? You ask. The scribe beside you, Elali, a short man with calloused fingertips and eyes like spent charcoal, barely looks up. Names? Yes, you say, tapping the tablet with your fingernail. These recipes, these notes, they're all unsigned, he shrugs. We write what we see, we don't sign dinner. And that, right there, is your introduction to one of the quietest mysteries of Mesopotamian cuisine. Why are there no named chefs? In all the dozens, maybe hundreds of recovered culinary tablets from the ancient Near East, there are next to no surviving names of actual cooks. Scribes, absolutely. You'll find names like Ipku Amuru, Enlil Zeri, and even a Nabu Apla Idina attached to long lists of grain or trade inventories. Temple administrators left their names on legal documents, land grants and livestock tallies. But the people who developed and repeated the recipes? Who turned mutton and beer and garlic into sacred stew or festival bread? They're ghosts. You ask Alali if he finds that strange. He shrugs again. The cook doesn't speak. The food does. It's poetic, sure, but also practical. In temple kitchens, cooking was a collective effort. No one person owned a dish. No one claimed authorship of the barley porridge or the roasted date sauce. These were inherited, communal, constantly evolving. Besides, the real authors were the gods, or so the system claimed. Dishes made for divine offerings weren't creative expressions. They were rituals, repeated the same way every time, with minimal variation. Adding your name to the process would be like signing your name on an altar. It wasn't just unnecessary, it was presumptuous. You remember the temple priest's words from days ago. The gods don't eat the food, they eat the order, so the cook follows the order. The scribe records the action. The name, not important. Still, you wonder. Surely someone invented these dishes. Someone had to be the first to mash dates with barley, to glaze duck with fermented fruit, to boil onions with goat blood and coriander. Who was the first to toss leeks into a fish pot and go, wait, that's actually really good? You walk through the main kitchen again, slowly, watching the cooks move. And you start noticing something. The whispered corrections passed from hand to hand. The subtle tweaks to fire intensity. The way one apprentice slaps the dough twice before flattening it. The way a different one adds a sprig of mint just because. These are fingerprints, invisible signatures. You're not reading names, you're tasting them. The historian in you is frustrated, but the human in you, the part that knows a good. Stew can't be footnoted. That part understands. Food here wasn't a performance. It was a function, a sacred, serious one. Cooks weren't praised, they were expected. And if they did their job well, no one noticed. But if they failed, you remember the story of the oversalted fish, the apprentice who miswrote onion as leek, the cook reassigned to courtyard sweeping after burning the goat fat for Inanna's feast. So anonymity wasn't just tradition, it was protection. Even In royal kitchens where banquets require dozens of cooks and assistants, there's no surviving record of a master chef. The king's cupbearer? Yes. The scribe of the royal vineyard? Absolutely. But the man or woman who prepared the 7-meat stew for the spring festival? Unnamed. And yet, you suspect that reputation still existed, just not on clay. The head cook in the temple doesn't need his name carved into a tablet. You can tell who he is by how everyone waits for his nod before removing a lid. How his silence stills the entire courtyard. That's legacy. You remember Daya from the street corner, her honey cakes, her wild herb mix. She'll never be named in a document, but her food tells her story. And maybe, in this world, that was enough. Still, it makes you reflect. In today's world, we chase credit. Attach names to every recipe, every dish, every photo of a plate on social media. But in Mesopotamia, it wasn't about credit. It was about continuity, about passing down without possessing. You sit down on a stone bench, watching the firelight dance against the darkening sky. In a few hours, the night cooks will prepare the midnight stew for the moon goddess, Nana. The same stew as last week, as last year, as last century. No one will sign it. No one will innovate. And no one will taste it, except the gods. You reach into your pouch and pull out the small tablet from yesterday, the one that simply reads, meat, onion, fat, garlic, water, serve hot. It's unsigned. But now you know, someone wrote this, maybe, not to be remembered, but to remember. You press your thumb gently into the clay's edge where there's just enough space left for a small mark. Not a name, just a fingerprint. Not claiming, just witnessing. And then you set it back on the shelf. The thumbprint you left on the clay tablet lingers in your thoughts like the final note of a forgotten lullaby. That simple, silent impression, no name, no title, somehow feels louder than any signature could. It's a reminder that, in ancient Mesopotamia, food wasn't owned. It was remembered, repeated, revered. And one thing they remembered in almost every single dish: onions. Yes, onions. Allium cepa, the teardrop-shaped culinary backbone of nearly every pot you've peered into over the past week. Today, you're tracing its journey from field to feast, because if any ingredient deserves its own epic in Mesopotamian cuisine, it's the onion. You start the day walking along the outer edge of the city, where irrigation canals snake between grain fields and gardens. Nippur may be dry and dusty in its heart, but out here, water brings life. Palms sway, barley nods in the breeze, and near the edge of a low stone wall, rows and rows of onions peek out from the cracked earth. A young farmer waves as you approach. He wears a tunic tied at the waist with fraying rope, and carries a basket of just-picked onions still dusted with soil. He invites you to help, and you accept, kneeling beside him as he pulls each bulb gently from the ground. They're not the large papery onions you're used to. These are smaller, denser, and almost always red or golden brown. Their smell is sharp, enough to sting your eyes as they pile up in the basket. He laughs as you rub your face. You're not the first, he says. Nana weeps every time we harvest. You ask him how long onions have been grown here. He shrugs, then gestures to the canal. As long as there's been water and mouths to feed. He's not wrong. Archaeological records confirm that onions were cultivated in Mesopotamia as far back as 2500 BCE. They appear frequently in cuneiform texts, ration lists, medicinal tablets, and, of course, culinary records. They were among the most dependable, versatile, and beloved vegetables in the ancient world. You ask him how many onions his family uses in a week. Too many to count, he says. We eat them raw, boiled, crushed, dried, pickled, burned, and sometimes just to make other things better, which brings you back to the kitchens. You return to the temple courtyard just in time to catch the morning prep. Fires are lit. Dough is kneaded. Lentils soak in warm water. And across every station, you see onions. Every single station. A stew pot simmers with chopped onions and lamb fat. A skewer of roast fish rests on a bed of grilled onion slices. A barley cake is being brushed with onion garlic paste before hitting the coals. Someone is even boiling onion skins to make a dye for cloth used in a purification ceremony. The head cook spots you and waves you over. "Watch this," he says. He takes a handful of finely chopped onion, tosses it into a hot bronze pan slick, with sheep's fat, and stirs. Instantly, the scent changes, softens, deepens. The sharpness melts into sweetness. You can feel it happen. The transformation of harsh to mellow, raw to refined, acrid to aromatic. That, he says, is the difference between food and flavor. You ask him why onions are so important. "They teach you patience," he replies. "You can't rush an onion. If you do, it punishes you." You remember the old priest saying something similar. Onions, like gods, must be approached slowly. It turns out, onions weren't just ingredients. They were medicine, currency, and symbol. Medical. Tablets describe onion infusions used to treat respiratory issues, digestive problems, and even sorrows of the heart. Other texts mention onions as offerings for the sick, and not just as food, but as spiritual fortification. They were thought to cleanse the blood, sharpen the mind, and even ward off evil spirits. One clay tablet recovered from a temple near lists the following. Take 1 onion. Crush in beer, warm with honey. Give to the afflicted at sunrise. A cure? Maybe. Or maybe just the ancient version of chicken soup. You move to the tavern quarter now, curious to see how onions play outside the temple's rigid rituals. The streets are already alive with sound. Sandals on stone, voices bargaining, the splash of water on packed earth. A vendor hands you a fried bread parcel, stuffed with mashed onions and lentils, seasoned with mint and ground coriander. It's wrapped in date palm leaf and still steaming. It's glorious. Crispy on the outside, soft inside. The onions are sweet and sharp all at once. You ask what it's called. "Just bread with the good thing," the woman says with a grin. She tells you her mother adds a few drops of fermented fish sauce to the onion mash. Her neighbor uses sour beer instead. The word recipe doesn't quite apply. The onion filling is whatever you make it. You wander further, stopping to try pickled onions in tamarind brine, onion jam with crushed raisins, and something that tastes suspiciously like an early version of onion chutney served with fried emmer. By mid-afternoon, you've tasted 7 onion dishes, none of them the same, and yet all of them tied together by that recognizable bite. And the best part? No tablet mentions any of them. You ask a young woman near the canals, carrying baskets of harvested onions, if her family writes down their recipes. She laughs until she snorts. We don't write them, we remember them, and we change them, depending on what we have. If the rain is late, we use dried herbs. If the bread is stale, we fry it with onion oil. But the onion, it's always there. It's the first flavor we learn, and the last one we forget. That sticks with you, because for all their importance, onions in Mesopotamian texts are almost always just there, taken for granted, rarely described, rarely praised. Like the chorus of a song you always hum, but never question. You return to the temple as dusk sets in. A pot of onion broth is simmering for the priest's evening meal. A small child peels tiny shallot-like bulbs with surprising precision. A scribe jots down yet another variation of meat in broth with onion and garlic. You sit quietly, watching the flames flicker beneath the pot. The scent, sweet, soft, familiar, wraps around you like a warm blanket. And you think, in a world of gods and grain, war and writing, trade and tablets, the onion was the quiet constant, unseen, uncelebrated, but always, always there. The true author of every flavor and the unsung hero of every pot. You wake before the sun. The sky above Nippur is still ink blue, with only a pale shimmer on the eastern horizon hinting that morning is on its way. The streets are quiet, save for the creak of a wooden cart and the distant splash of a water jug, being filled at the canal. Today, you're going somewhere new, somewhere that smells less like incense and more like sweat, beer, and burnt barley. You're heading to a Mesopotamian tavern, or, as the Akkadians would call it, a bit sabiti, literally, house of drinks. But don't imagine a sleek pub with mood lighting and well-dressed servers. Think instead of a mud brick shack, walls blackened by smoke, benches carved from stone slabs, and air thick with the musk of people who've been drinking since sundown and might not stop until the next ziggurat festival. You find one near the northern gate of the city, just off the main canal. There's no sign, no name etched above the door, but the smell of fermented barley beer, grilled leeks, and fried dough is unmistakable. You push aside the reed curtain and step inside. It's dim. Light filters in through small, soot-stained windows. Clay oil lamps sputter on wall niches. In one corner, a woman tends a fire beneath a massive bronze cauldron. In another, a man snores into a half-finished bowl of stew, arm draped around an empty jug. Somewhere behind the walls, chickens argue loudly about something. You take a seat on a cool stone bench. The table is chipped but solid. Within moments, a young girl places a clay jug of thick beer in front of you. No menu, no words. Just expectation. You sip. It's warm, cloudy, gritty. Fermented with dates and barley, the flavor is more sour porridge than IPA. But it's oddly refreshing, especially once you get past the sediment. This isn't casual sipping beer. It's breakfast, lunch, and dinner in liquid form. And as the tavern slowly comes alive around you, gravelly voices, hacking laughter, the clatter of clay bowls, you begin to understand the true role of this place. This isn't just where people eat, this is where they escape. Taverns in ancient Mesopotamia weren't simply eateries. They were social spaces, gossip centers, informal courts, matchmaking hubs, places where business deals were sealed, arguments settled, songs sung, and sometimes knives drawn. The line between kitchen and courtroom blurred more here than in any temple. A woman named Zabitu appears behind the counter. She's the owner, or more precisely, the innkeeper, a profession almost always occupied by women in Mesopotamian society. Legal texts, trade tablets, even morality poems make this clear. The tavern was a woman's realm, and Zabitu runs hers with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who's spent 20 years feeding drunks and chasing thieves. She eyes you. You'll want the stew. You nod. She ladles it out herself. A dark, thick mix of lentils, garlic, leeks, goat trimmings, and yesterday's barley mash, all bubbling in a shallow pan of sheep's fat. It's not pretty, but when it hits the table, steaming and rich and smelling like regret and comfort, all at once, you're already reaching for a chunk of bread to scoop it up. You take a bite. It's bold, salty, spicy, messy. The garlic is borderline aggressive. The fat coats your tongue, and the barley mash at the bottom has turned into a caramelized layer of pure joy. This isn't temple food. It's not balanced. It's not sacred. It's real. You ask Zabitu how she makes the stew. She shrugs. Whatever's left. She points to a jar of pickled onions, a basket of dried lentils, a slab of salted fish. Sometimes I use that. Sometimes I use breadcrumbs. Depends. This isn't improvisation. It's survival. You realize, tavern food in Mesopotamia was fundamentally different from temple or royal cuisine, where temples had structure and symbolism, and palaces had extravagance. Taverns had necessity. The cook's job wasn't to honor the gods. It was to fill a belly for 2 copper bits, and do it fast, with whatever was on hand, and they got creative. Zabitu shows you a flat cake she's baking over hot stones. It's made from leftover barley mash, mixed with crushed onion peel, chickpea flour, and beer yeast. The result? A chewy, tangy cake with a crisp edge. She calls it shikaru luwu, which roughly translates to drinker's bread. You watch her serve a bowl of fish stew to a tired merchant who just trudged in from the southern gate. The fish is barely cooked, the broth cloudy, but he slurps it down like it's the last meal on earth. You ask him what he thinks. It's hot. It's fast. It doesn't lie. You ask if he eats here often. Every day, he says. The temple asks questions. Zabitu just feeds you. There's something comforting in that. You glance at the wall. A clay tablet is wedged between two stones. It's cracked, grease-stained, and barely legible. You ask about it. That? Zabitu laughs. That's the only recipe I ever wrote down. It reads, goat, onion, garlic, lentil, salt, beer, fire. You nod. It works, she shrugs. It better. But taverns weren't, just for eating and drinking. They were centres of community drama. A man near the back slams his bowl down. She owes me fish, he yells. Zabitu points her spoon like a sword. You paid for lentils. You got lentils. Next. The man grumbles. Everyone else chuckles. This happens every day. Taverns were often mentioned in legal disputes, property, fights, debts, marital infidelity. One ancient tablet even records a man suing a tavern keeper for serving him spoiled beer that made him vomit during a wedding. The court ruled against him, probably because he vomited on the judge. And yet, despite the occasional brawl or bad fish, taverns thrived. They existed in every major city, often clustered near gates or canals. They catered to labourers, soldiers, travelling merchants, scribes, off-duty, and the occasional priest sneaking a drink in civilian clothes. They were tolerated by the authorities, sometimes taxed, occasionally blamed for social decay, but always essential. Even the famed Instructions of Shurupak, one of the earliest wisdom texts, warns, do not pass judgment in a tavern, do not linger in the alehouse, which of course means everyone did exactly that. Back at your table, you're handed a second bowl. This one is a sour beer soup with garlic dumplings. You hesitate. Zabitu smirks. Cures everything. You take a bite, and somehow it really does. As night falls and the last light slips away from the clay walls, you realize something simple and beautiful. The tavern isn't just where Mesopotamians ate. It's where they lived, where they gossiped, traded, fought, loved, mourned, and celebrated. Where stew was cheap, onions were plentiful, and no one asked too many questions. Where names didn't matter, but faces did. Where everyone knew who sat at which bench, which stool creaked, and which beer jug was lucky. You sip your last bit of stew straight from the bowl. Zabitu nods at you with approval. Now you eat like a local, and for the first time in days you feel not like a visitor to the past, but like someone who belongs. The night after your tavern adventure is deeper, darker than usual. You lie on a rooftop mat, staring at the stars scattered like barley across the sky, belly full of stew and brain full of questions. There's a breeze coming off the canal that smells faintly of fish, ash, and sesame oil. Familiar now, almost comforting. You're halfway between sleep and memory when a question floats up in your mind. How did they preserve all this food? In a world without refrigerators, ice boxes, or even decent pottery glazes, how did Mesopotamians keep their ingredients from rotting in the scorching sun, the wet season, or the long droughts? You wake at dawn, determined to find out. And so, today, your journey takes you into the cool, smoky world of ancient preservation. Not just storing food, saving it, extending it, learning how to keep something alive long after it should have spoiled. A kind of quiet miracle, one that makes every feast, every stew, every temple offering even possible. Your first stop? The Salt House. Near the western edge of the city wall sits a small walled compound with only one visible entry. A low wooden gate, bleached pale by decades of sun. Inside, it's quiet. Too quiet, given the labour happening here. You step into a courtyard lined with large clay troughs, all filled with briny, sludgy water. Workers move slowly between them, hunched, bare-legged, careful. Salt, says an older woman stirring one of the vats with a flat wooden paddle. Her name is Luma. She's in her 50s, wears a sash tied over one shoulder, and has the kind of calm authority that doesn't need to raise its voice. She explains. Salt is harvested from evaporated water drawn from salty marshes, slow-boiled or sun-dried, then scraped into coarse, chunky crystals. The best salt, she says, comes from downstream of the Tigris, where water is muddy and heavy with minerals. You ask what they use the salt for, she smirks. Everything. It goes into meat rubs, fish brines, vinegar pickles, grain storage, and even medical salves. A good salt house like hers isn't just a supplier. It's the beating heart of the kitchen's memory. She shows you the drying tables. Long, flat slabs of baked clay, where hunks of fish have been rubbed with salt and left in the open air to dry. Some are laid whole, others have been cut into thin strips, jerky-like, hard, almost translucent. This fish will last months, maybe more, if kept dry. Nearby, in shaded clay jars, you see pickled turnips, garlic cloves in vinegar, and something that smells like salted apricot paste. Luma hands you a small wrapped bundle. Open it when you're ready for lunch, she says. You nod. You'll save it. Next, you visit the grain storeroom. Now this, you learn, is where real preservation magic happens. Grain is everything in Mesopotamia. Barley, emmer wheat, spelt. It fuels bread, beer, porridge, even cakes. And storing it safely is a sacred art. You follow a temple scribe named Tamar through a narrow corridor lined with giant sealed jars, each nearly as tall as a man and sealed with a waxy resin. He taps one with a stick. Barley, he says. Harvested 3 seasons ago. Still good. You raise an eyebrow. 3 years? He nods. It was dried well. No insects. No rot. The gods smiled. He shows you the process. After harvesting, the grain is dried in the sun on slanted clay tiles, then swept into storage with a mix of ashes, dry mint leaves, and sometimes salt to ward off pests. The top is sealed, then stored off the ground on wooden platforms. Bad grain, Tamar says, can kill you. You nod, remembering stories of mouldy grain leading to madness, even death. No wonder the temple took storage so seriously. He leads you to a side room filled with small clay boxes, each labelled with year, crop, and sometimes a symbol you don't recognise. He explains, these are fermentation starters. Beer, he whispers, and vinegar. You get a brief, but fascinating, tour of ancient fermentation culture. Tamar shows you how they keep beer yeast alive in little bundles of dried dough mixed with fruit skins. For vinegar, they pour old beer into clay jars with honey and crushed dates, then let it sit. In a few weeks, the whole mixture sours, then stabilizes. Don't drink it too soon, he warns, or you'll see demons. Noted. You leave the storerooms and head to a meat butcher's courtyard, where preservation methods are louder and bloodier. A man named Dagon is already halfway, through butchering a goat. The smell is sharp. Blood, bone, fresh sinew. He tosses meat into one basket and bones into another. The entrails go into a clay pot for other things. What do you do with the meat, you ask? Depends, he says, smearing sweat from his brow. If it's eaten today, salt and fry. If not, he gestures to the far wall where hooks hold strips of drying meat, brown and leathery. Jerky, he says, sometimes smoked over dung fires. You flinch. He shrugs. Dry is dry. The gods don't care how it smells. You ask about long-term storage. Boil it, pickle it, or seal it in fat. That last one catches your ear. Turns out Dagon and his assistants often cook meat down into soft stews, then pour it along with melted sheep fat into sealed jars. The fat cools and solidifies, forming a layer that locks out air. It lasts for weeks, even months, if untouched. You realize this is an early version of confit, long before the French, long before ducks. Everything old is new again. At midday, you finally unwrap the little lunch bundle Luma gave you. Inside is a tiny pressed cake of salted fish, barley mash, and dried plum paste. It smells intense, sour and sweet and funky. You take a bite. It's strange, but good, like a power bar designed by an eccentric fisherman. You sit on a low bench beneath a fig tree, chewing slowly, watching two children carry a jar of dried onions up a ladder to the temple kitchens. You realize that every ingredient you've encountered today, salt, vinegar, grain, meat, oil, ash, air, was part of someone's plan, someone's labor. Preservation isn't just a necessity, it's an act of trust, a promise to the future. In a land where floods destroy fields and droughts kill livestock, where wars roll through like seasonal winds and temples rise and fall, the ability to keep food safe isn't just survival, it's civilization. You imagine a cook hundreds of years from now opening one of these jars. Will they smile, grimace, laugh? Will they know your name? Probably not, but they'll taste something old, something preserved, and in that moment, they'll remember.